An officer stops a Hispanic judge at the courthouse. What happens next will shock you. Isabella Reyes was running late again. As she pulled up in front of the Miami-Dade County Courthouse, she glanced at the clock on the dashboard of her sleek black sedan. 10 minutes until the trial started. Her pulse quickened. This was the day she had both dreaded and meticulously prepared for. Today marked the opening of a landmark case, one that had the power to reshape the way racial profiling was handled in the entire state of Florida. She took a deep breath, grabbed her leather briefcase from the passenger seat, and stepped out onto the courthouse steps, unaware that the next few moments would be a test of everything she stood for. Stepping out of her car, Isabella Reyes took a steadying breath, squaring her shoulders. As a respected Hispanic judge, she had faced her share of challenges navigating the legal system, but this case carried a different weight. It wasn't just about the law, it was personal. The defendant, a young Latino man named Alejandro Vargas, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without cause. The officer who detained him claimed he fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. The words were all too familiar. Isabella walked briskly across the parking lot, her heels clicking against the pavement with purpose. Instead of entering through the courthouse's grand staircase where a swarm of reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing, she opted for the side entrance. Today wasn't about media attention, it was about justice. As she approached the door, she noticed a young white police officer standing at his post. His posture was stiff, his gaze tracking her every move. Isabella instinctively reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck, her standard routine before entering the courthouse. But before she could even lift it, the officer stepped directly into her path. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said, his tone clipped and firm. Isabella blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I'm Judge Reyes," she said, holding her badge up for him to see. "I'm presiding over the Vargas case this morning." The officer barely spared a glance at the badge. His eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over her, his expression unreadable. A slow burn of frustration ignited in Isabella's chest, but she kept her face composed. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." His voice was laced with suspicion. Isabella exhaled sharply, staring at him for a long moment. The irony was palpable. She was about to oversee a trial about racial profiling, and here she was, being profiled at the courthouse doors. "Officer," Isabella said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse quickened, "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." She held out her badge again, hoping, praying he would just take a second to look at it and realize his mistake. But he wasn't budging. His posture remained rigid, his hand hovering dangerously close to the handcuffs on his belt. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're going to need to come with me." Isabella's breath hitched. This was escalating fast. She saw the look in his eyes, the same look she had seen too many times before. Not just skepticism, but something deeper, something more insidious. This wasn't about her being a judge, this was about her being Latina. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Isabella turned toward the voice. An older Hispanic officer was approaching, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. "Reyes," his eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Judge Reyes, yes," she replied, her voice tight. The older officer turned sharply to the younger one. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The younger officer hesitated, still fuming, before muttering, "She matches the description." "That's the judge." The older officer's voice turned to steel. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer clenched his jaw and mumbled something under his breath before finally backing away. Isabella forced herself to breathe. She couldn't let her emotions take control. "Not here, not now." "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his voice softer now. She gave a small nod, though her jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. "I'm fine, thank you." Without another word, she turned and walked into the courthouse, her heart still hammering in her chest. The familiar, sterile halls wrapped around her like a shield, offering the comfort of routine. But no matter how much she tried to shake it, the encounter outside played on an endless loop in her head. She had dealt with discrimination her entire life. But for it to happen here, now on the day of this trial, was almost too much. As she stepped into the courtroom, she took her seat at the bench, squared her shoulders, and banged the gavel. Court is now in session. The trial began smoothly enough. Opening statements were made, legal arguments exchanged. But Isabella's mind kept drifting back to the officer outside, his sneer, the way he had dismissed her in an instant. It was too close, too similar to the case she was presiding over. Then came the first witness, Alejandro Vargas himself. Isabella leaned forward slightly as he took the stand. His testimony was raw, painful. He spoke about the night he was stopped, about simply walking in his own neighborhood when the flashing red and blue lights had cast long, eerie shadows across the sidewalk. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even been acting suspiciously. Yet, within moments, he was thrown against a police cruiser, handcuffed, and humiliated in front of his neighbors. Isabella felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had heard stories like this before too many times. But today, it hit differently, because this wasn't just about Alejandro Vargas. This was about the countless others like him, and it was about her. Halfway through his testimony, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Isabella's breath hitched. The young officer from earlier, the one who had stopped her, walked into the room. His face was pale, tense. Isabella's eyes followed him, every nerve in her body on edge. The prosecutor stood, addressing the court. "We would like to call Officer Bill Wilkins to the stand." Bill Wilkins. She hadn't even caught his name before. She watched as he made his way to the witness stand, his movements stiff, awkward. She had to remind herself, stay professional, remain impartial, but it was hard. This was the same man who had looked at her not as a judge, but as a suspect. Wilkins shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Officer Wilkins, can you describe your role in the arrest of Alejandro Vargas?" Wilkins cleared his throat. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Vargas," he began, his voice noticeably less certain than it had been outside. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there. Isabella's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place, that phrase. She had heard it before, too many times. It was code for something else, code for he was Latino, and I didn't think he should be there. The prosecutor didn't let it slide. His tone sharpened. "What exactly made Mr. Vargas look out of place, Officer Wilkins?" The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on Wilkins. And Isabella Reyes was waiting. Bill fidgeted in his seat. He was acting nervous, looking around. It seemed like he was up to something. Isabella felt the anger bubbling inside her again. She had read the case file. She knew the truth. Alejandro Vargas had been waiting for his rideshare. That was it. No crime, no suspicious behavior. He had simply been a Latino man in the wrong place, at the wrong time, at least in the eyes of the police. The prosecutor wasn't letting up. "Did you find anything on Mr. Vargas that suggested he had committed a crime?" Bill hesitated. His face flushed red. "No," he admitted, "we didn't." A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Isabella could feel the tension thick in the air. She glanced at the jury. Some looked shaken, others seemed conflicted. But the truth was undeniable. Alejandro Vargas had been arrested for nothing more than being Latino. Bill's testimony continued unraveling with every sharp question from the prosecutor. Small inconsistencies appeared. His version of events fell apart, and Isabella watched it all. She noticed the way his eyes flickered toward her, the discomfort in them. He knew who she was now, and he knew exactly what he had done. By the time the prosecutor finished, Bill Wilkins looked like a shell of the man who had tried to detain her outside the courthouse. Isabella felt no pity, but she did feel the weight of this moment. Because this case, this trial, wasn't just about Alejandro Vargas. It was about an entire system. A system that had allowed officers like Bill to operate unchecked for too long. As the trial continued, Isabella fought to keep her emotions in check. She had to remain neutral. She had to ensure that justice was served. But it was hard, impossible, almost, because the parallels between her experience and the case before her were too glaring to ignore. By the end of the day, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The defense attorney made his closing statements, trying to paint Bill as a well-meaning officer who had simply made an honest mistake. But Isabella knew better, and so did the prosecutor. Samantha Green, the prosecutor, rose for her final argument. She turned to the jury, her voice steady, powerful. "This case is not just about Alejandro Vargas," she began. "It's about a pattern that has gone unchecked in our justice system for far too long." She took a measured step toward them, her words deliberate. "It's about officers like Bill Wilkins, who see a young Latino man in a neighborhood and assume he must be up to no good. It's about how those assumptions turn into wrongful arrests, into humiliation, into injustice, and it's time to say enough." A hush fell over the courtroom. Isabella could feel the shift. The jury was listening. They understood. When the trial finally came to a close, Isabella dismissed the courtroom for the day. But she remained seated at the bench for a moment longer, staring at nothing in particular. Her mind raced. She had done her job, presided fairly, followed the law. But the encounter outside the courthouse still gnawed at her. It was a reminder of brutal, undeniable truth. No matter her position, no matter her accomplishments, she would always be seen first through the lens of her race. The door to the courtroom creaked open. Sergeant Miguel Herrera, the older Hispanic officer who had intervened earlier, stepped inside. He walked toward the bench, his expression lined with concern. "Judge Reyes," he said softly. "Can I have a word?" Isabella looked up, surprised. "Of course," Herrera sighed. He glanced around, ensuring they were alone, before speaking. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened earlier with Wilkins." His voice was low, measured. "He's not a bad kid, you know, but he's got blind spots like a lot of them do." Isabella held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Blind spots?" she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You mean racism?" Herrera winced, but he didn't argue. "Maybe, probably." He exhaled slowly. "But I want you to know I'm trying to fix it from the inside." Isabella studied him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that real change was possible. But after everything she had seen, everything she had experienced, holding on to that hope felt impossible. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet. "What do you suggest I do when I'm sitting up here, day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing what I've experienced firsthand?" Herrera was silent for a long time before finally answering. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. You keep holding people accountable. That's the only way things are going to change." Isabella nodded slowly, though the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial wasn't over yet, and there would be more battles to fight. But for today, at least, she had taken a step forward. As Herrera left the room, Isabella glanced around the empty courtroom. The fight was far from over, but today justice had been served. And that, she thought, was a start. The following morning, the air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The jury had been deliberating all night. Today, they would deliver their decision. Isabella sat at the bench, waiting. Across the country, the case had been picked up by the media, turning into a symbol of the systemic discrimination still plaguing law enforcement. Her mind drifted back to the previous day. Bill Wilkins, the officer who had profiled her, had sat in that very courtroom, visibly shaken. He had realized something. His own testimony was unraveling the very system he had always trusted. For all the courtroom's weighty silence, Isabella had seen it. The cracks in his voice, the tension in his face. Bill Wilkins wasn't an outlier. He was a product of a flawed system. Her clerk, Emily, entered the chambers, holding a folder. "The jury's ready," she said softly. Isabella nodded, rising from her chair. She took a deep breath, smoothing her robe. "Let's do this." As she walked toward the courtroom, her footsteps echoed through the hallway. The courthouse felt different today. The tension wasn't just in the courtroom anymore, it was everywhere. It pressed in from all sides, a silent anxiety everyone was carrying. Isabella entered the courtroom. She felt the weight of the moment. Bill Wilkins was already there. He looked far less sure of himself than the day before. His eyes darted nervously around the room. And for the first time since the trial began, he looked small. Like a man who had finally realized he couldn't outrun what he had done, Isabella cleared her throat. "Please bring in the jury," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of the moment. The heavy wooden doors swung open. The 12 jurors filed in, their footsteps echoing in the hushed courtroom. Isabella's eyes followed them as they took their seats. She tried to read their expressions. Nothing. Their faces were unreadable. Her own expression remained composed. The jury foreman, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice, glanced down at the verdict slip. She took a breath before looking up. "In the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we the jury find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Isabella's gaze flicked toward Alejandro Vargas. He sat frozen, his face blank for a moment, as if he couldn't process the words. Then relief washed over him. His lawyer patted him on the back. Alejandro blinked rapidly, his eyes glistening, but he refused to let the tears fall. Isabella turned next to Bill Wilkins. His hands trembled. His face was ashen, shaking. His lips parted slightly, as if searching for something, anything to say. I need to say." He swallowed hard. His gaze dropped to the floor. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices, cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry." Silence, a deep, heavy silence that wrapped around the entire room. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. It was an apology, but it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Bill didn't try to defend himself further. Didn't ask for understanding. He simply stood there. And for the first time, Isabella saw something in his eyes. Understanding. The courtroom began to empty. Isabella remained seated for a moment longer, watching. She saw Alejandro Vargas embrace his family, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. She saw Bill Wilkins standing quietly by the exit, waiting to be escorted out. The weight of his guilt settled over him like a storm cloud. Isabella exhaled slowly. She had done her job. She had upheld the thing she still clung to, hope. Then, a voice, Judge Reyes. She looked up. Sergeant Miguel Herrera stood there. His voice was soft. "Can I have a word?" Isabella nodded, gesturing to the seat across from her. Of course. Herrera sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "Waiting. I just wanted to say thank you." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Sergeant Miguel Herrera leaned forward, his voice measured. "For handling this case the way you did," he said. "For holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Isabella let out a slow breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough." Her voice was quiet, yet firm. "This was just one case. There are so many more. And officers like him, they aren't born thinking this way. They're taught it." Herrera sighed. "I won't lie, it's hard." His voice carried the weight of years spent navigating a system that resisted change. "There are a lot of guys like him, but there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. And I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Isabella studied him. She saw the weariness in his eyes, but also the determination. It was the same determination she felt, despite the setbacks, despite the frustrations, despite everything. Herrera stood, straightening his uniform. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. That's how we change." The trial was over. But its impact had just begun. For Isabella, the fight for justice wasn't confined to this room. It stretched far beyond these walls, into neighborhoods still struggling, into courtrooms still deciding, into lives still at risk. She stood, gathering her files, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned. Alejandro Vargas stood before her, his attorney at his side. His face was calm now, though the past few days had clearly worn him down. "Judge Reyes," he said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Isabella looked at him for a long moment before responding. "You don't need to thank me, Alejandro. I was just doing my job." Alejandro shook his head. "No, it's more than that," he exhaled, glancing around the emptying courtroom. "This trial, it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." Their eyes met. And for the first time since the trial began, Isabella saw not just relief, but understanding. "I know," she said softly. "But it's a start." Alejandro nodded. "And for that, I'm grateful." Isabella watched Alejandro Vargas leave, his attorney close behind, but she couldn't shake the feeling. There was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict. It wasn't enough to dismantle a system that had been built over centuries. But she knew Alejandro was right. It was a start. She sighed, turning toward her chambers. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway, steady, deliberate. Then she froze. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Bill Wilkins. He stood just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick. A mixture of guilt, anger, and something unspoken. Wilkins straightened, clearing his throat. "Judge Reyes," his voice was hoarse. His gaze met hers, unsure but determined. "I didn't expect to see you here." Isabella remained silent, waiting. She didn't know what he could possibly say that would change anything. But still, she allowed him the moment. Wilkins swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. His words carried weight. "About everything. About what happened in there. And about what I did to you." He paused. His hands fidgeted at his sides. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Isabella's arms remained crossed. Her face was stern. She had heard apologies before. But what mattered now was what came next, and what changed now. Isabella asked, her voice even but sharp, "The fact that you got caught? Or the fact that someone finally called you out on it?" Bill Wilkins winced, but he didn't back down. "I know I screwed up." His voice was raw, stripped of the bravado he once carried. "I know I let my biases take over, and I'm trying to understand that now. But it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight." He exhaled, his shoulders tense. "I've been taught to see things a certain way. And I didn't question it until now." Isabella studied him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she nodded. Her mind echoed the words from earlier. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. That's how we change piece by piece." She nodded again, this time to herself. "Piece by piece," she murmured. Wilkins gave a small, uncertain nod before stepping away. As Sergeant Herrera left the room, Isabella sat back in her chair, staring at the now empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today, they had taken one step forward. And that, she thought, was a start, the end.